It's 1919 and there's a gruesome war on the fronts of Europe. But while there's a war in Europe, there's another one back on US soil, a war on prohibition. When most people think of gangsters, they think of Al Capone, Johnny Terrio, etc. But what they don't think about is who is the king of them. Who is the king of bootleggers? George Remus wasn't like the average bootlegger. Using his manipulative and micromanagement skills, he was able to create the biggest bootlegging empire of the 20th century. He pressured the legitimacy of the prohibition, leaving a legacy of rebellion towards the alcohol banning law known as the Volstead Act. This story begins on November 13, 1876, in Germany, the home country in which the legend was born. When Remus was 4, his family immigrated to the United States, where he lived a short time in the city of Baltimore. They then moved again to Milwaukee for another short period of time, and finally chose a permanent solution in Chicago, where his father found a job as a lumber scorer. George Remus disliked the concept of unskilled labor and did not want to participate in a job that required some skill. He wanted to learn and master a skill that would then in return provide a career, thus beginning his strive for greatness. So when he was 14, he began to work with his uncle in the drugstore at Milwaukee and Chicago Avenues. At a young age, he showed promise, and in his teenage years, he enrolled in the Chicago College of Pharmacy. At 19, he passed the test to acquire a pharmacist's license. And at 21, Remus saved up enough to buy his uncle's drugstore. That turned out to be very prosperous because 5 years later, he bought another. But eventually his love for the pharmaceutical industry died down. So he began a new challenge, one that would lead to the bootlegging industry. The ambitious man began attending law school during nights and worked during the day. After finishing a 3-year course in an astonishing, hard-working 18 months, he took his Illinois bar test, in which he passed. He set up a law firm in Chicago and became a trial attorney in 1901. Remus had defended around 18 convicted murders, but most of his clients were sentenced to death by execution. His most successful and well-known case was the William Cheney Ellis murder trial of 1914. A Cincinnati merchant who was convicted for murdering his wife, a case that lasted for 3 weeks. One where George Remus forced the man to plead insanity and landed him a mere 15 years in prison. On October 28, 1918, the U.S. Congress passed the Volstead Act, causing the ratification of the 13th Amendment, making the production and sale of alcoholic beverages illegal, thus beginning the increase of a certain crime known as bootlegging. George Remus during this time was still running his law firm and earning what would now be considered $630,000 a year. When the 13th Amendment was ratified, he began to start defending multiple people for liquor violation. These men he were defending were making hundreds of thousands of dollars with no educated background and no class. He liked being an attorney, but noticed that the prohibition was a chance of making easy money, and he had figured these men were incompetent compared to him. But he did not want to be a low-level and weak bootlegger like they were. He wanted to create an empire. His ultimatum was to acquire every single drop of whiskey from the US. Because according to the Volstead Act, Title II, Section 3, the pre-existing alcohol cannot be destroyed, meaning that there were still gallons and gallons of untouched beverages left in the respected distilleries. Meaning he didn't have to make any of the alcohol. All he had to do was find a way to legally obtain this inventory to avoid being convicted by the US government. After countless hours of studying the Volstead Act, he found out that he could legally purchase and keep the alcohol if it were for medical purposes, but he needed a permit from the Commissioners of Internal Revenue. Still, this made a perfect opportunity considering his past relations within the pharmaceutical industry. But he also needed a physician prescription to be able to sell them to the customers. Luckily, he had his connections, making that a little simpler. Next step was figuring out how to distribute the alcohol on a larger scale. He decided that he will sell them to other pharmacies, creating an allegiance with them, while creating his own new pharmacies. After a while trying to bring his business up from Chicago, he came across multiple troubles that led him to move out of the city and into the city of Cincinnati. But this wasn't because people there liked being drunk or the law enforcement was weaker. It was because 80% of the US whiskey can be found in the 300-mile diameter of Cincinnati.
300 miles of cow shit.
And 80% of the bonded whiskey being stored in this country.
On top of that, the city had a big ethnic group of German citizens, and since it was the alcohol brewing capital, it was not fond of the Volstead Act. To cover his tracks even more, he formed a trucking company that would transport the liquor that he purchased from the distilleries.
Remus owns the distilleries and the pharmacies they're allowed to sell to. Even better, Remus owns the trucks that hijack his own liquor.
He did this because he created a small group of smugglers and thieves that would steal from his own trucking company while they were transporting the alcohol. And when it was stolen by the thieves, they would relocate it to a hidden 50-acre farm that would later be called Death Valley Farm because of its small militia that guarded it and its rough terrain. Which meant that if the police were to find the place, George Remus would have no connections to it. He would have meetings with the government officials and federal marshals where he paid them off an average of what now would be considered $12,200. He did this while maintaining a high social status with his community. Side note, the Great Gatsby was actually modeled after him. This was because he would throw extravagant parties and give out Rolexes and cars as party presents. He would even donate some of his money to charities. But eventually the money and power got to him. He started referring to himself in the third person.
Ain't you George Remus?
Who did you think I was?
Like all good stories, it must come to an end. Eventually the police had caught up to him, and by the end of his reign as the King of Bootleggers, he made up to $644 million in traded liquor. The federal agents of Chicago and Indianapolis raided his farm and indicted him on 3,000 different charges. But remarkably enough, he was only sentenced to 2 years of prison, where he met an undercover federal agent known as Franklin Dodge. He was sent into jail to befriend him and find out a way to liquidate his bank accounts. Stupidly enough, George Remus told him that his wife Imogen had control over his money. Franklin resigned from his job and had an affair with Imogen, Remus's wife. In the end, it was his cheating wife that brought an end to his empire. By helping Franklin liquidate Remus's asset, she had stole millions of dollars from him and ran away with the man who put him in jail, and only left Remus with $100. This drove him crazy because when he was let out, he tracked down his ex-wife, drove her off the road, and killed her in front of witnesses in Eden Park. When he was prosecuted for the murder of his ex-wife, he became his own attorney and did his classic insanity plea on the basis that she drove him crazy, which surprisingly worked and only led him to 6 months in an asylum. When he was let out, he retired from the bootlegging industry when he found out that it was run by a bunch of gangsters, and moved to Covington, Kentucky, where he died at the age of 77 in 1952 of natural causes. This man left a legacy on the Volstead Act, which eventually came to an end in 1933, and his small militia that he commanded were either put into jail or escape conviction. This man had truly earned the title, the King of Bootleggers. But most kings don't last forever, and his war on the Prohibition came to an abrupt ending. He could be considered the general while his buyers were the foot soldiers, because in the end, no matter the situation or the place, war never changes.